You may or may not be familiar with Brent Bochek for a variety of reasons. First of all, the man dedicates time to the muskie community like very few others. He enjoys speaking. He's incredible at it, and for that reason, he gets pulled in every direction. At the 2019 Odyssey, he did a fantastic Muskies 101 seminar. I'm not sure if you can find it online or not, but very detail-oriented without wasting your time, and a lot of important things that can help shorten your learning curve if you're new to the sport. We went with the philosophy that the people at the symposium likely are not new. I'm sure some of you are. Don't be offended otherwise. So what we talked about doing is having Brent do something a little more advanced. So he's doing a presentation on making every cast count. And he's going to show you some skills and tricks that will help turn follows and opportunities into actual catches. Brent is also a guide, a full-time guide. He guides both in the Kawarthas and for salmon on Lake Ontario. His guide service is called Fish NV. You can also see him on TV. He's Setting the Hook with, I think it's just called Setting the Hook is the TV show. He also has a YouTube channel, Setting the Hook with Brent Bochek. What you could do as a symbol of good faith for the services that Brent gives, i.e. speaking for free all the time for Muskies Canada events and doing the symposium for us as well. You can go to YouTube and follow Brent. He has a long list of fantastic sponsors. He may tell you them, and he deserves those sponsors, but the sponsors like to know that the world is seeing their stuff. So if you could go and do a small favor, go over to YouTube sometime in the very near future. Check out his videos, educational, entertaining, and a great way to pass a Saturday morning when you can't go fishing. And give his page a follow and a like, and that'll go a long way to helping him. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Brent onto the screen and give him a chance to speak to you.
Hey, thanks, guys. Thank you very much for the introduction there, Danny. Really appreciate it. I think we're like 30 some odd days till muskie season opens, maybe 37, 38 days or so. So
who's
pretty
counting?
exciting. The countdown's on. I know I've been doing a bit of countdown on my own Facebook page, and I haven't done it in a few days, so I'd have to go and check to see exactly where we are, where we're at with it. But I just want to say, it's you guys are doing a fantastic job here. It sucks that we couldn't have a real Odyssey this year or a symposium in person. And, it's really, I know people really appreciate what you guys are doing here. You're doing a fantastic job raising money for research for muskie fishing, which, we're all here because we love muskie fishing and muskies, right? So we all love catching them. And the only way we can catch them is if we have a sustainable resource that, with reproduction and everything else. And research is a big thing that goes into that. So hats off to you guys. Appreciate what you're doing for it. So I guess we got 35 days till the Kawartha opens. So as Dane said, my name is Brent Bochek. I guide in the Kawarthas for muskie. I do stuff on Lake Ontario for salmon and trout. I've gotten away from the bass and walleye stuff because it just gets to be too much, and I'd rather concentrate on muskie up there. And I live in the Niagara region, right in between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and we have the Niagara River, which is right half an hour, 40 minutes to the east of me here. So, even though I'm not up in the North Country or where there's a lot of smaller bodies of water, we have some great fishing right in the Niagara region here. But first of all, we're going to talk about making every cast count, and also we're going to talk about some spring tactics, what it takes to put fish in the boat in the springtime. A lot of people always think fall is a big fish time, but those 50-inch fish, fish that are 50 inches in the fall, are still 50 inches in the spring too. So, we have a great fishery in the spring as well. Everybody wants to get out when muskie first opens. Let's make the most of it. So let's bring up the slideshow there, Lisa, if you could, please. So as I said, we're talking early season muskie locations and making every cast count. How do we make every cast count? We talk about muskies being a fish of 10,000 casts. Years ago, they used to say 100 hours to catch one muskie. If you fish 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, you're catching like one and a half fish every 2 weeks. Fortunately, it's a lot different nowadays. Fortunately, we have our electronics, we have seminars, we have magazines that we read, the internet, all kinds of information out there that have made us all better fishermen. So how do we make every cast count? One of the things we have to do is make sure our hooks are sharp. There's absolutely no excuse to go out in the water and not have sharp hooks. It's one of the easiest things we can do. This blacktail here, or these blades, there's one treble hook on it. It only takes a couple minutes to take a file and sharpen that up. Sharpen your hooks up. It only takes a couple minutes. Even if it's on a bait like a suet, there's 3 treble hooks on there. Spend your time in the winter sharpening these hooks up. When it comes time to be on the water, you just got to touch them up every now and then. But make sure all your hooks are sharp before you even hit the water. If you got to take a minute or two when you're on the water to sharpen them, make sure you sharpen it, because when you do have that fish hit, you want to make sure that cast counts. You want to be able to put that fish in the boat. Give yourself every opportunity to land that fish. One other thing we're going to go over is body positioning. Body positioning is huge. I have a couple of videos here where, and I'll get into them in a little more detail, but it shows you how important body positioning is when you're casting, when you're setting the hook, and it can be the difference between landing a fish and going home with a skunk. I know a few years back I was fishing up in the French River and had a nice fish hit on the Sunday. Got it to the boat. I lost the fish close right by my feet. Just it wasn't ready to be netted yet, but it was right there. And the problem was I didn't get a good hook set because of my body positioning, the way I was working the bait. My own fault. The fish did everything it could. It hit the bait. I put the bait where the fish was. Body positioning didn't allow me a good hook set. Paying attention and accurate casting. Being prepared. These are all things we have to do, which we'll get into a little bit more as well. You got to start strong and finish strong. Finish stronger. So let's move on here. Why do we need sharp hooks and solid hook sets? This is a really small fish here, but I was able to slow the video down, and you're going to see this fish come out of the water and shake his head about 4 or 5 times, and just the veracity that he does it with and the speed. If you don't get a solid hook set and sharp hooks, you're not going to land this fish. So let me just, I have a monitor behind me here, so if I look behind me, just excuse me for a second. So just watch how many times this fish comes out and shakes his head violently, trying to throw that surface. It's a Weagle surface bait he's got in his mouth there. Because as you can see, the way he goes back and forth, nope, there we go. The way he goes back and forth with his head like that, we have to have sharp hooks, solid hook sets, line with no stretch. That's going to help you make that cast count. And then body positioning as well. One of the big things with body positioning is, if I can just put me back on the screen for a sec, Lisa. Whenever I'm working a bait, I want to be coming across the front of my body. I have the rod in my left hand. I roll with my right hand. I'm always bringing my rod across. If I'm working a jerk bait, across the front of my body like this. If I'm working blades, I'm still on an angle where I can come back and set the hook this way. Crankbaits, anything. I want to make sure that I'm able to come across from left to right when I'm working a bait when I go to set the hook. So let's just take a look at this next little video. There's a few things, before we do that actually, there's a few things with body positioning. It's important when you work at a bait, you also want to be comfortable. When you're casting your bait, you want your body to be in a position where you're comfortable. I don't like being right on the edge of the boat. I like being a step or two back. It's a little safer that way. Speaking of that, if I'm fishing by myself, quite often I'll be in the back of the boat where you're not getting thrown around by the electric motor. You can be, you're a little more stable back there. But, oops, there we go. So I make a cast out here and we're reeling, and you'll notice my body positioning, I'm able to set the hook. If we, oops, there we go. There we go. I'm like, okay, if we go back a little bit here, see where my rod tip is there? And watch it after when I set the hook, watch where my body ends up. Oops. Watch where my body ends up. So you can see me turning there, and you can see how far the rod tip actually travels. So the rod tip's out in front of me. The rod tip probably traveled 10 feet or more. And my body turns. I'm able to step back with that low stretch line, sharp hooks, a good heavy action rod. You're able to really bury those hooks. So we go on to our next one here. Oh, it's getting late and getting tired and get a little bit lazy. Now, you'll see, you can drop that off for a sec, Lisa. You'll notice in that video there, my rod tip hardly moved at all. It maybe moved a couple feet. I'm setting the hook on my backhand, and I have nowhere to go with it. Across the front of your body, I've got all that room to turn, just take a step back, and set the hook. On the backhand, I have nowhere to go with it. Fortunately, we did land that fish. But on that other hook set, on the video before this, we actually had to cut the fish out of the hook, or the hooks out of the fish. The hooks actually penetrated right through. Easier to cut the hooks to get the hooks out. Then on this one here, we ended up with one hook in it. We might have had more hooks than that when it first bit the bait. But when it got to the side of the boat, we landed it. It had one hook in it, and we were able to get it out very easily with pliers. But not having proper body positioning, I just didn't have the power and the leverage and the room to set that hook really good. So another thing we got to really pay attention to is the first 10 feet, first 10 feet and the last 10 feet of a cast. And of course, any time in between, we got to start strong and finish stronger. So in the first 10 feet of a cast, a bait hits, you're casting a bait, especially if it's something like blades, it hits the water. If it just flutters down, it's going to look very unnatural to a fish. You want to make sure you stop the bait before it hits the water and engage your reel. As soon as those blades hit the water, you want them spinning. If it's a jerk bait, it's going to hit the water. I don't want to have it hit the water and get a pull right away. Muskie are very curious. If a bait hits the water and that fish is close by, he's going to take a look. It's human nature. We hear a bump or a bang or whatever. You hear a thump in your house, you're going to take a look, see what it is. You hear a noise outside, you're going to go take a look. Muskie are the same way. They're going to take a look when they hear something splash in the water. If your bait falls through the water column unnaturally while you engage your spool and then start reeling, the fish is going to turn away. You know something's going to be wrong. You want to make sure you get those blades rolling right away. And then, so if we go to this next little video, it kind of shows you why. You can see, oops. On this here, I say I cast out, I stop the bait, and the second pump, there's a fish on it. Oops. Where are we going here? Oh, sorry. There we go. So one pump, two pump, boom, fish on.
Nice.
If I would have let that hit the water without engaging my spool or having my spool engaged and get that fish rolling right away, or my bait rolling right away, that fish, obviously I cast right close to that fish. I would not have caught that fish. We would have missed that fish. It would have been a wasted cast. We wouldn't have made that cast count. Once again, on this video here, you see my body positioning. I'm able to turn, set the hook, get pressure on that fish right away. And on this fish also, I believe we actually had to cut the hooks out as well. So, and there's another quick little point when we're talking about, we're talking muskies, we're talking research and that. It's a lot better to cut hooks out of a fish than it is to start ripping and with pliers and all that if the hooks are in deep. Make sure you get in there, get a quick, safe release. But that's a seminar for another day. We're talking about finishing strong as well. This is a video, I've played this video many times before. You're going to see in this video, it breaks things down quite a bit. When I'm casting out, I'm not putting a lot of effort into it. I'm letting the rod do the work, letting the bait load the rod up. firing it out, stopping the bait before it hits the water, get it moving right away. And another thing, you talk about finishing strong. That means we got to be looking in the water and paying attention the whole time. I always tell people on my boat to look a foot below the bait and a foot behind the bait. You're still going to see your bait. You're going to see your bait coming in, but I'm trying to tell people to watch what's coming in behind it. So you notice as we go through this video, you'll notice how I react when the fish comes in. The fish grabs, I make a turn at the boat, the fish grabs it. And one of the really important things is I set the hook, but I keep the fish moving the whole time. My net's behind me. I got to bring the fish forward, turn it around, go to the back of the boat with it so I can grab my net, turn the fish, bring it around again, and then turn it so I can net it. The important thing there is to make sure when you get a fish hit at boat side, whether your net's ready or not, or if you're fishing by yourself or with a partner, keep that fish moving forward the whole time. You have to keep pressure on that fish. I've had people on my boat before where they've caught a fish boat side, and instead of keeping that fish moving forward, they've kind of stopped and waiting for the net. You can't wait for the net. You got to keep pressure on that fish the whole time. Let's just take a quick look at this, and we'll just watch everything transpire. See, I'm watching below the bait. I'm watching in the water. Oh, I notice a fish, make a move. Okay, you'll notice there when I got the fish in. Actually, one thing you want to make sure you do, it doesn't matter if you're fishing by yourself or with somebody else, make sure your net is in a position where you can get a hold of it, and that it's not, when you pick it up, it's not going to be tangled in all kinds of hooks and other rods and that. I like to keep mine at the side of the boat. I know, fishing with John Anderson back in the fall, he keeps his right in the middle of the boat. You can see it on that slide there. It's right in the middle there, sticking up. Wherever you're comfortable with it, but make sure it's not tangled in anything else so that when you do go to use it, you're not going to lose a big fish at the side of the boat because your net's not ready. Another thing is I always usually have rod holders on my boat. I do a little bit of trolling. I'm mostly a caster, but I keep those rod holders on there, not for trolling all the time, but for putting the net in. Once the net's at the side of the boat, I'm able to use my net as a big live well. The fish is in the net, it gets a chance to chill, relax, and I put the net in the rod holder. Nobody has to hold on to it. The fish isn't going anywhere. I'm not going to lose my net that way. And even after I bring the fish out, I don't have to worry about the net because it's still in the rod holder. I don't have to worry about it falling in the water and drifting, floating away or sinking or anything like that. When it comes to rods, we spend a lot of money on rods. There's so many different kinds of musky rods out there with different actions on them. I like throwing a rod that's about 8'6" for most of my casting. I know nowadays we're getting rods over 9 feet long. When I first started musky fishing, my first rod was a Fenwick, and it was 5'9". I used that rod for jerk baits. I used it for blades. I used it for everything. I didn't know any different at the time, but it was a great jerk bait rod. Not as good for throwing blades and stuff. Couldn't cast that far with it. But over the years, the trends of rods have gotten longer. This rod here I'm using is an 8'6" Abu Garcia Veritas. It's an extra heavy. And the baits you're using really have to be matched up to your rod. Or pardon me, your rod needs to be matched up to the bait you're throwing. You can see John there in the front of the boat. You can see the suic on his bait, on his rod there. You can see a bit of action in his rod. He did when I show this video, you'll see him fling that out. He's not putting a lot of effort into it. He's letting the rod do the work. You're going to see me cast in slow motion here. I come back a little bit, almost throwing it like a lacrosse ball. And as I go forward, the rod's loading up. And if the rod is the right action for the weight of the bait you're throwing, your bait's not going to flip in the air as it's going through. It's going to fly fairly straight. You're going to be able to stop it before it hits the water and engage it right away as soon as it hits the water. You're going to be able to make that cast count. If you're casting out and you're casting over where there's a fish and your bait's flipping, going head over heels, doing a somersault and tangles up, you're not making that cast count. There's no chance of catching that fish. So let's just take a quick little watch here. You done not a lot of effort, made a nice long cast there. I don't bring it back very far there, just a little bit. Let the weight of the lure load the rod up and let the rod do a lot of the work in your cast. Because that's a 14-inch Frankensuic I'm throwing there. And as soon as it hits the water, start retrieving it. So it's really important to make sure that the rods you're using are matched up to the weight of your bait. I have probably 2 rods in particular that I use when I'm fishing, musky fishing. One I'm throwing big rubbers with and throwing jerk baits with. The other one I'm throwing blades with. The one I'm throwing blades with is a little bit lighter action. I think it's a heavy, as opposed to the extra heavy that I'm throwing jerk baits with and big rubbers. So it just gives me a little bit more play on that rod, a little bit more action when I'm throwing the bait out. If I'm using a little bit lighter rod, when I'm trying to throw those heavier baits, they're not going to cast as far because the rod doesn't have enough energy to throw those heavier baits. And if I'm using throwing blades on a rod that's too heavy, it's not going to load up enough to use the energy that's in that rod. Another thing when you're making every cast count, you want to make sure that if your partner hooks a fish, you do everything in your power to make sure you net that fish for him. We're talking about making those last 10 feet count, boat side strikes. This fish, we didn't get the fish hitting on camera here, but John was actually looking at me talking, and muscle memory, as he does every single cast, he makes a boat side maneuver, and he had a fish come up and grab his bait right at his feet as he's making a blind boat side maneuver. As he fought the fish, took it around one side of the boat and brought it right back around to the motor, I was able to net it. But you'll notice in the video, I've got it slowed down, where I go to net the fish, and the fish starts shaking its head. I pull the net back. I go to net it again. The fish starts shaking its head again. A couple things. You want to make sure you have the bag of the net in your hand. I don't like leaving that bag of the net hanging when I go to net a fish. I want to have that bag of the net in my hand, and as I go down to net the fish, I can release it when I'm ready to net it. You'll notice here I pull back a couple times, as I was saying, because the last thing you want to do when your partner's fighting a fish is get those hooks tangled up in the net or screw up a net job. Did you get right both sides there, John? One yeah. Nice fish.
You're going around the other side, Brent.
Big old net here ready. So you can see there I got my net or the net of the netting of the net in my hand. Go down up. Oh, fish starts flopping there. Pull back. Pull back again because the fish just wasn't quite ready. John gets his head up and then try to get it right in the center of the net. Nicely done, sir. All right. Okay, as you can see there, I pulled the net back twice as that fish started shaking its head and trying to dive down again. So I was saying the last thing you want to do is get those hooks caught in the net on your partner when he's trying to land a fish. So just kind of be aware of that. I learned that trick salmon fishing years ago to hold on to the net handle. Hold on to the netting of the net as you go to net a fish. As soon as you're ready to net him, you can drop that netting and let the fish hit the bottom of your net. One thing when you have your fish in the net, don't be going and lifting them up on the fish. Keep it in the water. I use the rod holders. John puts his netting onto a cleat there so he doesn't lose his net. Take the hooks out in the water. Only have the fish out for a couple seconds for a picture and then get them right back in. Weed flats and points. We're talking places between spawning grounds, summer rain. Did I go past one here? Oh, there we go. Sorry. So we're in what? tomorrow's the 1st of May. Muskies are probably spawning right now up in the Kawartha Lakes. I haven't been up there to check the water temperatures, but they're probably going to be anywhere between 45 and 50 degrees anyways. So muskie will spawn when the water gets between 50 and 55 degrees. I always thought it was about 55 degrees. The other day I heard Dr. Sean Lansman talk about it being 50 degrees. I believe what Sean says, so I've changed my presentation here to say 50 to 55 degrees. And they're going to be done when it hits around 60 degrees. They're going to be spawning in shallow, weedy bays, sometimes in rivers as well. I'm thinking about the Kawarthas in particular, so I'm talking about lakes. They will go up the creeks to spawn and some of the rivers that run into the Kawartha Lakes. So one thing you got to remember, muskies are broadcast spawners. They don't protect their eggs. They're not like a bass where they're going to make a nest and protect them. They're going to go in there, they're going to lay their eggs, and then they're going to leave. The males are going to be the first to the spawning grounds, and they're going to be last to leave. Kind of like a 19-year-old going to the bar. He's the first one there in the evening. He's the last one to leave at night. So that's kind of something you can think of also when you're muskie fishing in the springtime, when the season first opens. The males are going to recover a little quicker than the females. They're going to be active a little quicker. So if you're getting a lot of smaller fish in the spring, they're more than likely males. Once they do spawn, the males are going to be active a lot quicker. They're going to be on the feed a lot quicker. The females will still feed, but they're probably going to be dropping off a little bit, dropping off those weed edges, maybe a little bit of deeper water to recuperate, which doesn't mean they can't be caught. You just have to take a little bit different approach. You can be casting into the weeds on one side and then out into deeper water on the other side of the boat. And you might be catching a male fish on the inside, and on the outside you could catch a female fish, which possibly be a little bigger. So in the springtime, what I'm looking for, I'm going to be looking for weed flats and points. I love fishing points, windswept points, rocky points, places in between spawning grounds in their summer range. If you can figure out where the fish are spawning and you think you know where they are in the summertime, in June, especially those first 2 weeks, there's a good chance you can interrupt those fish between the spawning grounds and where they're going to be for the summertime. One thing I really like fishing is over top of weed beds. There's a lot of places that'll fish in the springtime that in the summertime, the weeds are up to the top 8 feet of water. But in June, quite often, they're maybe 3 or 4 feet. So you have lots of water over top of those weeds. The nice thing about those spots is if there's not a lot of weed growth yet, a lot of the fish in the system are going to be using those for cover. The weeds provide cover. They provide for smaller fish. They provide ambush points for bigger fish. So the first stop after spawning and travel routes. So if we look up at the very top there on the right side, for example, I know muskie spawn up in there. And there's also on the right side, there's a little bit of an inlet there, a little tiny little bay. I know they spawn in there as well. These are also places where we catch crappie and bluegill in the spring. And I've seen muskie in there as well. Sometimes I think they're just kind of cruising in there. You get maybe they're in there feeding a little bit. But they're not going to be in there. And if I can just get my pointer here. Get a laser pen going. I don't know if you can see the red dot there or not on the screen. So I'm talking about this little bay here and the bay up at the top here. So if a muskie's in there and he lives out in the main part of the lake in the summertime, he's going to be following these routes. There's a weed bed here, right along here. There's a point there. It comes along another weed bed. He's more than likely going to follow the edge of those weeds as he slowly makes his way to his summer range. I kind of look at it think like a deer. If you ever watch deer out in the field, they don't come from out of the weed bed, out of the bush and walk straight across the middle of a field usually. The odd time if they're traveling, they'll either be in the bush or they'll be on the edge of the bush. You don't see deer out in the very middle of a field unless they've taken their time to get out there, usually under the cover of darkness. So I don't think a muskie is going to come out, leave his spawning grounds, and just make a beeline right across the middle of a lake to get back to his summer range. So these are places where we can stop and we can fish. We got a big right up here on the top, just outside of that bay. We got a weed bed. In June, quite often it's only halfway up, maybe 3 or 4 feet. It's not all the way up to the top. You'll have fish stop there. And if there's going to be resident fish there that are going to live there all year long, and there's also fish that are going to stop there in the spring just to kind of recuperate. It's a first stop after the spawning area. And they're going to be in there to feed, especially those male fish. The females might be dropped off a little bit. These are great places to troll as well. I'll do a lot of casting, but these are also great places to troll. As we come out where it says submerged cable, I know that I just know from experience that it's a rocky point there, comes off with big boulders, drops off to deep water, and then back inside it's nice and shallow and there's weeds. Always lots of panfish around. So it's a great spot for a bigger fish to stop. They can be out in the deep water if they want. They can come right into that shallow water to feed if they want. So you can just put me up on the screen for a second, Lisa. One of the things you're talking about, those fish being suspended over deeper water, they're not active fish. If there's a big female out there, she's not active, she's out there just kind of chilling, that's the time I'll throw a jerk bait out there. Something like a silk, or I can give it and I'll work it slowly. I can give it a pull, I let it suspend for a couple seconds, give it another pull, let it suspend. I'll work a bait slower out there. Sometimes we use big rubber baits. This is about a 9-inch curly Sue. I'll throw that out there. And I like working with big rubber baits like a jerk bait. This is a time I'll cast it out and just a real slow, steady retrieve, let that tail do the work. Muskies are opportunistic. They might not be in the mood to feed out there. There might be a little bit of a negative mood. But if they get a chance to eat something that's going by them, they don't know when their next meal's coming. You got a chance of catching that fish. I've caught a lot of fish in the early season where we've had some people are casting into the weed bed and some people are casting out into the deeper edge. And it's the deeper edge that always produces the bigger fish for us if they're casting away from the weed edge. So we'll go on to the next slide there. So during the early season, fish can be spread all over an entire weed bed or flat using emerging weeds as cover. It's important to cover the whole area that these spots can hold multiple fish. So this weed bed here just happens to be, it comes quite a ways out from the edge of the lake. And if I can get, oops, I want to put a highlighter on here. Yeah, there we go. So what I'll do on a weed bed like this is, I'll cast it because I'm primarily a caster. But if I have people on my boat and it's coming on, they're hungry or they're getting tired, what I'll do is I'll troll across this weed bed. And I'll start out here in the deep water. I'll come across the weed bed into this deep water. I'll make a turn out of the deep water, back across it, and I'll just keep doing this. And the reason I'm using the highlighter here is because this is what my GPS will look like. I'm going to use my GPS to leave a trail. I'll cover the whole thing and make sure I always come out over the deeper water just in case there's a fish out there. And it's kind of a surprise fish. We don't get a lot of fish over that deeper water, but when we do, it's usually a bigger fish. We'll just keep trolling like this. And then, after we do that, then I'm going to troll the edges. I'm going to go up. I'm going to come back this way. I'm going to come back in. I'm going to keep coming. I'm going to fish the whole thing. After I do it, my GPS is going to look like this. If I'm going to hit that weed bed later in the day, I'll change the color on my GPS to a different color. If I have red on there in the morning, if I fish it later in the day, I might go with green, just so that I can see where I'm covering what water I'm covering when I'm on there. What this is ensuring that I'm doing is I'm going to cover the whole weed bed. I'm not missing spots on it. I'm going to cover the whole thing. And this is another spot where you have emerging weeds where, as I said earlier, sometimes they might be 8 feet tall in the summertime. Right now in June, they're like 3 or 4 feet. And you can get multiple fish off these. It's one of those spots where you have resident fish all summer long, which are really keying in on the edges. But in the spring, you have resident fish that make their way there. Then you have fish that are also stopping there on their way to their summer range. So, windswept points. I love fishing windswept points. It's something in the Kawartha Lakes I don't see a lot of guys doing for some reason. I'm not saying guys don't fish these windswept points, but I've caught a lot of really nice fish off windswept points. You might only be in 3 feet of water, anywhere from 8 to 3 feet of water. Well, what happens when muskies love current? Wind creates current. You don't notice a lot of current in the Kawartha Lakes. So when you have islands and points and you have wind pushing through them or around them, that's creating current. What happens on those points is things get turned up. You got crayfish on there, they get all stirred up. And what happens then? Smallmouth come in to feed on them, rock bass come in to feed on them, other panfish will come in to feed on them, and then the muskies come in to feed on those. Muskies will become active in that wind when you get that water churning up in there. Sometimes you got to, if I have people in the boat, I'll make sure that I have them in a certain position and I'm controlling the boat so that they can maximize their cast. Sometimes you're getting pushed in right in there. So you got to, boat control is very important. Some of these rocky points you're fishing, you got to make sure you don't run your boat onto them. You don't want the people casting right up in, into the rocks. Well, you do want them casting into the rocks, but you have to make sure that you have the right baits so you're not going to get snagged in there. Around these rocky points, I like throwing jerk baits. It's one of my favorite things to do in there. It just seems they're in that wind, the baits are able just to hang in there for a couple seconds longer. The fish are in there, they're active, they're feeding. So I'll throw blades up in there as well. One of my favorite blades to throw is the Handlebars Double 10 with the, it's a brown perch color. So it's got a bit of orange on it, a bit of chartreuse, a yellow, and some browns on it. It just seems to be a great color in the Kawartha Lakes. But if you're not fishing windswept points, especially early in the season, you're missing out on a really good bite. Another thing about these windswept points, I haven't caught a lot of small fish on them. They've all, for the most part, have been bigger fish. We used to have a trailer up in the Kawarthas, and another fellow in our trailer park came up to me the one day, and he goes, and he fishes muskies quite a bit. He likes to use it. He's a troller, and he trolls a lot of jerk baits as well, and he's quite successful. But he says to me, he goes, I see up on that point there. Do you ever get any fish up on there? I go, I get the odd one, kind of being coy about it. He goes, yeah, but they're always small, eh? And I said, yeah. But to be honest about it, I don't think I've caught a small fish. There's 2 points I'm thinking in particular that I'll fish, and I don't think I've got a small fish on them yet. So those windswept points produce a lot of bigger fish for the Kawarthas. Short line trolling gives you the ability to cover water looking for active fish. 15 to 50 feet of line is all I'll ever use. I'll do a bit of trolling in the fall and some in the springtime. Excuse me. When I'm talking short line trolling, like if we go back to look at that slide I had where I was highlighting it, what I'll be doing is this is a rod day spinnerbait. I'll be trolling stuff like this over it. It's got the 2 blades on it. It's got 3 single hooks on it. I found a very good hooking percentage. I'll throw something like this double 10 on there as well. They just seem to throw off a lot of vibration. You got your motor going, that's throwing off vibration into the water. I had a very interesting discussion with John Anderson back in the fall about how muskies, John was saying how muskies actually learn to use the boat to hunt. When you're going through weeds and all that kind of stuff when you're trolling, it's stirring stuff up. Sometimes bait fish are getting disorientated. A muskie picks up on that. You got a bait 15 feet behind your boat, 50 feet behind your boat. There's a good chance you can catch that fish if he's coming in to see what's going on. And I found with these, throwing blades back there, you can also run real shallow crankbaits. But I find putting blades behind there like these, I've caught a lot of fish on it, and I've caught some really nice fish for people on them. One of my favorite fish we've caught doing that is I had a guide trip a few years back. The gentleman hadn't caught a muskie. He was in his early 60s, hadn't caught a muskie since he was either 14 or 16. He couldn't quite remember. And we were working a weed bed, and he goes, I'm going to stop and have some lunch. I said, just hold on 5 minutes. I got 2 trolling rods out. We started fishing. As soon as I got the rods out, they started eating lunch. I put 2 rods out. We're trolling. And I think he had like 1 bite left of his sandwich, and he had about a 44, 45-inch tiger muskie. Just crushed one of these rod day spinner baits. And we talk about making every cast count. Whenever you're on the water muskie fishing, you want to do everything you can to ensure that you catch a fish that day. If you're going to stop for lunch, you might as well troll. Make sure you got baits in the water all the time. As I said, we used to talk about muskies being a fish of 10,000 casts or 100 hours. Well, you know what? If you're going to be on the water for 10 hours in a day, make sure you got your baits in the water for 9 hours and 59 minutes of it. Opening weekend. So that fish, just go back to this one for a second. That was a 48-inch female, second week of the second week of muskie season. And it was about 500 yards from a spawning area, from a known spawning area. Whether that fish spawned in that area or not, I don't know that. But it was close to a spawning area. And it was on a route where I figured it was a route where muskies are going back to their home range, for their summer home range. Here's another opening weekend fish. This one was caught casting. Actually, it was caught on, that was caught on 8s, but still on the handlebars brown perch. 8 foot flat with emerging weed growth. Now, that could have been a resident fish on that weed bed, or it could have been a transient fish, which was on its way from its spawning area to its summer home range. These are a couple males that were caught in early June, close, and they're also close to potential spawning areas. They're fairly decent males, but taking a look at them, when we had them in the net, I know they were males. So on the picture on the left, you can see there's weeds right in behind there. That whole bay could be a possible spawning area. And in front of the picture on the right, if we go back in that way, that's also a potential spawning area for muskies. A little bit of a creek coming in there and some shallow weeds. Does anybody have any questions? I think we can go to some questions here, Lisa, if you want. Okay. Lisa, are you hi, Randy Nutter. Hi from Missouri. Hey, Randy. So, are you using weighted or am I using weighted Frankensuic? Yes, I do use weighted Frankensuics. Well, the nice thing about the Frankensuics is we can get rid of that slide there, Lisa. You want to get rid of the sides, Lisa? There we go. So the nice thing about these Frankensuics is, if you can see there, it's got a weight here and it has a weight there. They're actually interchangeable. I like them weighted. I like to get them down in the water column a little bit more. Yeah, you can get heavy. You can put heavier weights on them as well. And you can experiment with those weights. The more weight you have on them, the more neutral buoyant you can make them. So when you give them a pull, they won't raise up as fast. I don't find the weight gets them down as much when I'm working it. It's all about the rise. So when you got the weight on those suics, whether it's a weighted Frankensuic or a 9-inch thriller like this one here, you can see the difference between the 9 and the 14-inch suic there. That weight, when they're weighted, when they rise really slow, when they're almost just kind of sitting there, that's when a fish is going to hit it. They don't hit it so much when you're pulling it. It's more so when it stops and then it starts to rise a little bit, or when it becomes a little bit neutral buoyant. And there's a few things you can do to make them neutral buoyant. You can add more weight to them. Also, sometimes I'll take a rubber course sinker and I'll put that in right in front of my leader. And so I'll give it a jerk. It'll go down. It'll raise up about 9 inches to the length of the leader. Then it'll just kind of hang there. In the summertime, when you got high skies and high pressure systems coming through, that can be a real trigger. It's also a great time to do a trick like that during cold fronts in the summer or in the fall as well. Fluorocarbon or steel leaders? I use both. That's a good question, Steve. You know what? You can do a whole seminar just on leaders. When I first, I use a lot of steel leaders when I'm musky fishing. I also use fluorocarbon. They both work great. I know some guys will use fluorocarbon for everything. They'll use it for jerk baits and for blades or crankbaits. I think using a steel leader with just a snap swivel or with just a snap on the front, what'll happen is it actually gives you a little bit more movement on your jerk baits. So when I'm throwing jerk baits, I do like a steel leader. Fluorocarbon I'll use more so when I'm throwing blades, but you can go with either one. I like a solid leader for jerk baits, where if I'm throwing blades with a steel leader, it's going to be a 7-strand. Do I find bait size makes a difference in June in the Kawarthas? Years ago, people used to talk about, that's a really good question, Brian. Thank you. I used to always throw smaller baits in the spring. You know, this would be a big bait, a 9-inch suic, for example, would be a big bait, and I'd throw number 8s when it came to blades in the spring. Last year, I started throwing the Frankensooks, like the 14-inch baits, and I'll throw big grandmas in the spring as well. What really turned me on to using bigger baits in the spring was years ago, we're out walleye fishing in May, and I forgot my net. And we were catching all kinds of walleye using the jig and minnow. Not a big deal because you use a single hook, you can flip a lot of them into the boat. My wife's got about a 14-inch walleye on. It's at the side of the boat. I go to grab it, and about a 40-inch muskie comes up and tries to grab the walleye at the same time. After I maybe swore a couple times, counted my fingers, made sure they're all there, it got me thinking. I'm not thinking about walleye anymore. I'm thinking about this muskie that tried to eat a 14-inch walleye. If a muskie's going to try to eat a 14-inch walleye in May, he's not going to have trouble eating a 14-inch bait in June. I just think it throws off a bigger profile, a little easier for them to see even. It's going to displace a little bit more water. I have no problem throwing bigger baits in May, or pardon me, in June for muskie. Okay. Any more questions there? Or? Okay. Okay. Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming out tonight, and Danny, I want to thank you for having me on your show tonight. Really appreciate it.
Don't thank me, Brent. It's I that should be thanking you. I like I mentioned at the beginning, you give so much of your time, and I'm grateful for it. And I really think you did a great job at the presentation here. I love the way you break down the different sections of the water and the types of water. I really think anybody watching today should have seen a couple different approaches that they can try, even if you're doing, let's say your thing happens to be working those windswept points, then there's trolling the reefs as a different alternative. And it really highlights to everybody that you can't be one-dimensional when you're out there, regardless of the time of the year or what your expectations are. I think you did an awesome job showing us, Brent, how we can approach those different sections of water at that same time in early spring. So thanks for the education. Thanks for giving us a lead foot in the spring here. And I'm really, really, really hoping that at least a handful of people catch a fish and they can say, you know what, Brent Bochek put me in that right spot, or gave me that right idea, or led me in that right way. Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to follow Brent at his YouTube channel. And if you're looking for a guide up in the Kawarthas,
Fish Envy.
Fish Envy, sorry. Appreciate it. And with that, I think I'll wish you a good night. And thanks again, Brent. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Take care, guys.